20 years ago, his journey led him to the Mutual UFO Network, where he became an active member and has been state director of the Michigan chapter for the past 10 years, doing his best to uncover what clues he can about the UFO abduction phenomena for those like himself who have had first-hand contact experiences. Konkolesky is a regular lecturer at conferences, public libraries, and other venues. His personal abduction experiences have been featured on Sci-Fi's Abduction Diaries and ABC's UFOs Seeing is Believing, and he has served as a consultant for numerous cable programs, including History Channel's UFO Hunters and Discoveries Uncovering Aliens. His book, Experiencer, Raised in Two Worlds, reveals what his childhood was like, growing up as a normal little boy who discovered that, despite what parents may say, sometimes the monsters are real indeed. Yep. His presentation this afternoon picks up at a point in his life after the events of his book, when he entered young adulthood to discover that, surprisingly, aliens sometimes took a very serious interest in the directions of the personal lives of experiencers, and shockingly, time itself is not always what it seems. I want to add to this prepared introduction the fact that Bill and I met when some years back. He was kind enough to invite me out to give a talk for Michigan MUFON, and a more private one for people training to be investigators. I had a wonderful weekend. He was a marvelous host. We became good friends, and I read his book, Experiencer Raised in Two Worlds. I've read a number of books by experiencers, and most of them are not by trained writers. They're by people giving you their heart and soul and communicating their experiences to you. I can't think of a better one that I've ever read. It's extraordinarily balanced, and one of the few where the writer discusses with equal emphasis the positive experiences he had and the less than positive experiences. He's somebody I'm proud to call a colleague and a good friend, and we're lucky to have him here, Bill Konkolesky.
Oh, thank you, Peter. I don't know how I can live up to your introduction.
Do your best. Do your best.
Thank you. Okay, here's the sound again. Okay. First, yes, I am Bill Konkolesky, and my presentation does deal with a lot of time anomalies that I had during a roughly five-year period of my early 20s. Though the first thing I want to actually come out and say about time is what a wonderful time I've had here so far this weekend. This is a fantastic conference. I am so grateful to Audrey Hewins and the Starborn team for allowing me to come out and share with you. And it's been great meeting people, not just locally, but of course from places like England, Peru, Canada. It's been a great time this weekend. Also, kind of want to lead in with just a funny thing that happened about a month ago. It was the most recent high strangeness thing that happened to me, so what the heck, I'll bring it up. I was in bed. It was very early in the morning, well before I was supposed to get up for work, and a thought pushed into my head while I was dreaming, and this is not unusual. The entities often communicate to me like that in a receptive state. I think it's something along the lines that Nancy was describing earlier. There is a flexibility of your mind when you're in that dream state to be able to receive information and messages. So while I was laying there in bed, this thought pushed into my head that said, you can't stop us from landing in your backyard. And that was the whole message. And then I woke up. I'm like, what the heck was that? And I felt that residue in the immediate room where I could tell something had just happened, but I had no memory of it. And so I slipped back to sleep, and a few hours later I got up for work. And with that thought still in my head, I'm like, wait a second, what the heck was that? So I walk downstairs and I look out into my backyard to see the new swing set, big swing set we just put up, my wife and I just put up in the backyard for the kids, and all of their toys littered all over the yard. I'm like, oh, I get it. So they think that kind of like, I guess, how you put those little things on ropes to keep the pigeons from landing, that we constructed this thing in the backyard maybe to keep them from landing, so. Okay, so I've jumped through some of the hoops that people sometimes ask about. Have you taken Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Index? Yes, and it proved that I was not fantasy prone. Also, about a decade ago, I was part of a sleep study that was from Wayne State University in the Detroit area where I'm from. And they had me sleep for 3 nights in their hospital, wired up like crazy. And they wanted to monitor my sleep patterns to see if there was possibly anything that could have been causing my experiences that was based on some sort of sleep disorder, hypnagogic, hypnopompic stuff. And so they had a group of self-identified experiencers, several of them. I never met anybody else in the study that was a test subject, just the people that were running it. So they had a group of us, self-identified experiencers, sleep 3 nights in the hospital, and all wired up, and where they monitor us. And they had a control group as well, and they did the same thing to them to see if there was any difference. And at the end of the study, they came to me and they said, well, the simple answer is that there's nothing wrong with your sleep pattern. But we've been hesitant to want to tell you, but thought maybe, what the heck, we should, is that in fact, your sleep was better not only than all the rest of the experiencers, but all the rest of the control group. I had the best sleep pattern of anybody there in that study. Okay, and I also want to express a deep gratitude for the Mutual UFO Network. As was said in my introduction, I have been a member now for more than 20 years. And for the last 10 of them, I've been the state director of Michigan. I bring this picture up too for another couple good reasons too. The woman on your right, behind that gentleman, that's the anchor of the right hand of the picture, she is Shirley Coyne. She has now left this world, but during a time in my early 90s when I went to MUFON to uncover some of what happened to me, she took me through a series of regressions, half a dozen regression sessions. One of those sessions becomes very important to the narrative that I have here this afternoon, so please keep her in mind. Also, the gentleman behind her, Dan Wright, I often consider him sort of my UFO dad. He's been my mentor in investigating the UFOs, and he's been a wonderful source of information and support over the years. I also want to say I think it's really cool that I'm at least the 3rd person that's bringing him up this weekend. So I think that stands testament to what a great job he's done over the years. He's now retired from the UFO business, but we still keep in touch. He also is important in this and that. For many years, he ran the support group for our local MUFON group. Experiencers would come and, of course, share their stories, and we had a therapist with us as well, and it was wonderful, supportive, and it helped me tremendously. I cannot overstate. I cannot overstate how much he was of assistance. And after he left MUFON, I picked up the reins of holding and hosting the support groups for Michigan, and the groups continue, and it's been very helpful for our local community of experiencers in the Detroit area, and it's only building, and it's been very successful, and we keep going strong with that. Okay. So I've been waiting a long time to tell this story because I can't just go to the person on the street. I have difficulty, even amongst some individuals in the UFO community, to be able to tell this story because it is just so flat out bizarre that unless you've got some sort of vested interest, some background in the abduction phenomena, some of this stuff is just so bizarre that you can't really talk about it easily. And yes, some of the things I'm going to talk about in this span of time that covers about 4 years of my life includes time travel, being subjected to a time loop, being taken from time itself, and then also evidence that the ETs sometimes take a serious interest in the trajectories of the personal lives of experiencers. Now, this last part here, I bring up because in my presentation, you're going to hear a lot of personal details from my lives at the time. Friends I had, girls I dated, and you wonder why he, is bringing all of this stuff up. I am not doing it to simply wax nostalgic. All of the characters I put on the playing field here play a part in the what seems to be a very directed plan from the ETs to direct or at least support the course of my life over a short period of time. I feel my life has sort of fallen. I put it into 4 different phases. My first phase and my second phase are things that are covered in my book, Experiencer Raised in Two Worlds. And I say the title Raised in Two Worlds because, of course, I was a normal little boy growing up with a normal-ish life, but at the same time, I also had these high strangeness experiences going on with me. So in respect to that, the first phase of my life, the beings were very playful with me. They wanted to be my friends. It was all very nice. The second phase of my life, going into my teen years, is a period where things were a lot harder for me. They would often take me without much regard to how I felt about it. It was very scary, and I had a tough time with it. Then I went into the adult path, as I like to call it, where I formed, what I'm going to do with my life, who I'm going to be with my life, that sort of thing, and that's the main feature of what I'll be discussing today. The fourth phase is the outreach, which is connecting, networking with other people that have this type of experience or interest in this type of experience. So the first phase of my life, of course, that's me. Yay, kindergarten. Nice bruise on my cheek, yeah. I'm sure I got that from playing, not anything weird, but. So during this phase of my life, I'll start with my very first memory. This is my very, very, very first memory in life at age 2. So this isn't a memory that came back to me several years later. This isn't anything that I doubted for a while. This happened to me very explicitly, and it burned in my mind, and I never forgot it. It was the middle of the night. I was laying in my crib. This little gray guy comes up, just looks down at me, and I scream for my parents. My parents tell me to go back to sleep, and the little gray guy walks out of my room. And several years later, I'm jumping over a lot of the stuff that I said is covered in my book, where the aliens took an interest in me and seemed to be very playful. They had a very specific interest in when I would leave my body, which I sometimes did unexpectedly and without meaning to do so. When I was very little, they tried to teach me how to operate outside of my body. And while I could never really fully put my finger on it, all through my life, there's been episodes that any time that I've had a astral experience, they're always there. They're always very concerned about it. At age 7, this is the cover of my book, I got a scar on my arm. I was brought on board, and they cut my arm. I don't know why they did it. They sat me in a chair. I received this slice on my arm. As I looked down, it healed right before my eyes. And while I was sitting there in the chair, the being that was in front of me, which is one of the taller gray beings, I've seen many of the little gray beings in my life, also several of the taller grays. The taller gray says to me, "Oh, be very good, and you get to see the color blue." I'm like, blue? Kids like suckers and maybe toys, stickers, that kind of a thing. But, you're going to treat me by showing me the color blue. Well, after I got my arm cut and I looked up into the eyes of this being with its deep black eyes, they suddenly lit up a bright electric cerulean blue. And it was really mesmerizing, really calming, and got me through the experience. And the next day, during broad daylight, me and a little friend of mine were out playing in the backyard of my house, climbing trees, when this mist rolled through the backyard. And this mist was a little gray being that came up to me and asked me if I was all right, telepathically, and I said I was, and then it continued on its way. The next phase of my life, the education and experimentation, is when they really didn't seem to care. They didn't want to play with me. They didn't want to necessarily give me any treats. They would very forcefully take me from bed in the night and take me on board. And I would be laying there. I would see lights, sometimes nausea, sometimes I would have bloody noses, but never really certain what they were doing. And part of that, I knew that they were feeding me with some information, force feeding me with some sort of knowledge that they said that it wasn't the right time for me to remember. And guess what? I never figured out what it was that they were trying to tell me. For what it's worth, in this picture, just to show you what a unusual household I had, we have Coke and Pepsi there on the table. And no, I didn't smoke. That wasn't me. I was a good kid. So, how bad was my teen years? Extremely, extraordinarily traumatic some of the time. Once I was brought before a mantis being that was probably over 7 feet tall, very terrifying, very menacing. It had this vibe that it felt like it could just simply eat my soul. And it gave me the message to just basically play along. Don't question, just follow the rules and I'll be okay. And it was like being brought in front of the principal at the high school in a way, I guess. But yeah, this was a very, very scary experience. In fact, I was brought aboard so often during my teen years that I had sort of a self-defense system set up in my bedroom. This is a very nice map of my bedroom. So starting from the door, I would wedge a drumstick between the dresser and the door so that the door would only open so far, and once the door hit a certain point, it would make a knocking sound. And then I set the ceiling fan on the floor, floor fan right there in front of the door, and turned that on so that if I closed my eyes but felt something move in front of the fan, I would wake up because I knew somebody was in the room. Also, I either had the TV or the radio on, usually the TV, always had the light on. The curtains, I always kept closed so that they couldn't recon me by looking through the window. And And then also the dog, the family dog, I always invited her in to stay with me. And then my floor was just an absolute mess with papers, books, tapes, just everything all over the floor. And as much as my parents, my mother in particular, was supportive of me saying that unusual things were happening, I could never convince her that the reason I had a messy room was simply to keep the grays away. In 1989, I was a high school senior at the time. So yeah, that means I'm in my mid-40s. Somebody earlier this weekend said they thought I was in my 20s, which I guess means I could be my own dad. But so I was with a couple of friends in my senior year, and we had seen a pretty dramatic UFO event where a blue UFO flew slowly over our car, beautiful, gorgeous color blue. And then a white light then came and zigzagged across the entire expanse of the sky, and then that disappeared, and then a red light came on and off in the middle of the sky. And I bring this up because I don't know that this is the most recent version of my presentation, but that's cool, it works. I can play along with it. So the guys that you see in this picture are my closest friends from that point in time. Everybody's name that I bring up from this point is a pseudonym. From left, that's Herb. Kyle, me, and my friend Don. Kyle and Don were with me when we saw this UFO event, and all of these individuals play a part in what would happen next in my life, in my adult path. There was a turning point where I think that everything changed from just simply being an abductee. That's what I was in my teen years. I was an abductee. I was abducted, I was taken against my will, never had a good time with it, and lost a whole lot of sleep, and it really, really traumatized me. But a funny thing happened as I got out of high school. One night, UFO, well, I'll start from the beginning. I was in the kitchen, it was very late at night, and I knew they were in the backyard, that the Grays had come and that they were in the backyard. I couldn't see them, but their signature, their presence is unmistakable. The air was thick with their energy, and I said out loud, "If you're here, I don't want to see you. I would prefer some other way that you contact me. Maybe could you use the phone?" What the heck, it was worth a try, right? So after I said that aloud, and I'm giving you the edited version, this is still stuff that's in my book from this point, and I think the book describes it in a lot more detail. So I said, if anybody's here, I just want you to call me, and sure enough, the phone rang just like that. I'm like, oh my gosh. So I ran and I grabbed the phone, nobody was there, I hung up, I'm like, now what? But the crazy thing was that the energy then faded, and I felt comfortable. I'm like, okay, I think they're gone, but still I want to get my dog. Now my dog would look like Benji, just this little tiny thing, but it's a dog, she's my companion. I'll get her and have her with me and maybe feel a little bit better. So I got the family dog, and then when I got her, I didn't realize that getting the dog she always interprets that as a trigger of, oh, we're going outside, we're going for a walk. I'm like, no, we're not leaving this house. We're not going to leave this house. And she's running around by the front door. We're going to go outside. We're going to go outside. And I'm thinking, well, if she's not feeling any sort of fear about the situation, maybe they are gone. Maybe it is safe. And so she and I went outside. She normally goes into the backyard when we just let her out. But I'm like, no, let's go in the front yard. So we walked out into the front yard, and I saw it was a very clear sky. And there was only one thing in the sky, which was a disc-shaped cloud directly over the house. And it was just hovering there. I'm like, is that a UFO? Well, it looks like a cloud, but it was very perfectly sculpted. It wasn't fluffy, and it seemed to be illuminated, but I couldn't tell what was illuminating it, coming to the conclusion that it was probably somehow self-illuminating. And then it started to drift slowly against the direction that the wind was going, and then picked up speed and then shot off. So the next day, it took me a long time to get to sleep that night. But the next day, my friend Kyle came over, and he said, hey, our friend John, and this is part of that weird, awkward personal stuff that becomes important. He says, our friend John is going to have a birthday party in a couple weeks. And I said, okay, and I told him about the UFO event from the previous night. He and I were very open about it. He's had his own experiences. And I asked him, here's Kyle, who came over the next day, and friend John, who had the birthday party coming up. So I asked him, is it possible that Vicky is going to be there, who is a friend amongst our group of friends? And he said, why do you want to know that? Are you thinking of hooking up with her? And I'm like, she and I are going to be boyfriend and girlfriend. And he's like, oh, he's like, oh, you're going to make some play. I'm like, no. He's like, and I'm like, I never really thought of her as somebody I would date. And I'm not thinking I'm going to try to get with her, but we are. I said, at that party, she and I will become a couple. And it was just some unusual thing that somehow I knew, just knowing, and I felt that it somehow had to do with the experience that I'd had the evening before. So, yeah, so she and I dated for quite a while, about a year, which is a lot for that time of your life, I guess. But it was the most serious relationship I'd had at the time. She often said we were going to get married. I didn't see that that wasn't necessarily going to happen. So I thought, okay, yeah, this is, here we go. We're, getting going with my life mate here, sort of a thing. And things took a very dramatic turn at the beginning of January of 1991. I was walking down a rural road. It was, of course, winter, and it was up north in Michigan. I could tell the cold was very, very biting, and I wasn't very well dressed, and as I'm telling it this way for a specific reason. And I'm walking down the road, and I'm like, what the heck am I doing here? And I'm like, where did I just come from? What's going on? And I got really confused. I'm like, this isn't right. And I can tell, that obviously I had just walked from somewhere. I could see my footprints, but I'm like, what the heck am I doing? So I see a pickup truck up ahead and what appears to be a house. So as I walk up to the house, I look over and a little gray guy is standing there, and suddenly our eyes locked, and his eyes lit up a bright, shiny, supernova white, and it felt like it was sucking my essence. It was awful. I felt every negative emotion that I had ever felt. It was just this terrible, we're talking rage, guilt, sorrow, pain, just everything. I was racked with every possible negativity, and I felt like I was being eaten alive, and that I felt that I had died. And then, what's the next slide? Okay. This will become important in a moment. So anyway, I'll just leave it up. So then the next thing that happened was I woke up in my bed, and it was 2 p.m. in the afternoon. There was a knock on the door. My mother came in because I was still living at home at the time. I was 20, and she drops this letter on my chest and walks out of the room and leaves. And I'm completely drenched in sweat. I'm like, I was there. That wasn't a dream. I was just there. There was no sense of anything vaguely dreamlike about it. It was completely, utterly, and entirely real where I had been, and now I was completely someplace else. And I sat there in shock, laid there in shock for several minutes, and then I looked down, I'm like, oh yeah, there's this letter on my chest. So I look at it, and it's from Vicki, and this was a Monday, because that becomes important in a second. I open the letter, and it's a Dear John letter, basically saying, oh, we had a great time, but I need to do my own thing for me and whatever. And all I kept thinking was the creature, in that dream. And so I'm reading the letter. Dear Bill, it was great, blah, 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 blah. You can call me if you want. And I'm like, okay, an imperative, something to do, call girl. Okay, get up, call girl. And I'm just thinking, the creature. And so I hop on the phone with her, and Vicki answers, and she's like, hi, and I say, yes. She's like, is this Bill? And I'm like, yes. Oh, did you get my letter? Like, oh, and I'm like, yes. And I'm just thinking, the creature. I was completely numbed and anesthetized to everything else in my life. I was still dealing with what had just happened to me. And she goes, well, I sent that out on Friday, and we had such a good time over the weekend that I've changed my mind. Can we just kind of forget about that letter? And I'm just thinking, the creature. I'm not even there in a conversation with her. I just know she asked me a yes or no question. I said yes. That's fine, whatever. So she's like, so can you come over tonight? I'm like, yes. And she's like, normal time, 7? I'm like, yes. And she's like, all right, goodbye. I'm like, yes. And that was the whole phone call. And I just stood there, and I'm like, what on earth was just, and it was several hours later. obviously, that I went and drove to meet up with her. And I was still in a daze over what had happened. We got together and, we're sitting there, just kind of lazily, our arms around each other. And then it hit me. I'm like, what the heck did she just do? She sent me this letter breaking up and backtracked, and now I'm in her arms. I'm like, that is crazy. So I said, okay, I'm not gonna make any decisions tonight. I'm just gonna go on with it. And things did actually normalize with herself and me, and I thought, well, I did actually accept her back into the relationship, so okay, that's fine. Let's keep going and see where this goes. We ended up breaking up about another 8 months later, and shortly after that, in the month of November, I call it my autumn apocalypse. It was my thing back then. I thought, oh, that's so cool. I got this cool name for this bad stuff that was about to happen to me. But so in the course of a couple weeks, like literally 2 weeks, first of all, my friend Kyle says, and he again is the second one in from the left, he says, he goes, I want to tell you something. That right when you broke up with Vicky, she and I kind of dated for 2 months, and it was like right away. I'm like, you didn't tell me that? I'm like, that's so weird. And he goes, yeah, but we broke up, so I decided to tell you. I'm like, and this group of friends, I cannot tell you how tight we were. It's that kind of a thing where you see a group of friends and they have their own coded language and. They're always together, and, we were that type of group of friends. So this was extraordinarily painful for me, and I'm like, okay. And then you could tell the guilt was weighing on him. He's like, but it's not as bad as what Herb and Don did. And I'm like, oh? And they were like, yeah, they were kind of seeing her while you were seeing her. I'm like, these are my 3 best friends in the whole world, and so I'm like, this is just terrible. And so as I went reaching out to other friends in this particular group of friends, and we had a fairly large halo of friends around us, every single friend that I contacted said, yeah, I kind of knew about that, but didn't want to tell you, didn't want to be the one to tell you. I'm like, how many parties were she and I at where everybody knew and I didn't know? So I was feeling pretty terrible about that. At the time, I was dating a different girl, and she called and said, she actually left me for a younger man, strangely, but she was only a couple years younger than me, but okay, whatever, that was fine. She and I weren't dating that long. And then my parents tell me that they were going to divorce, which was a big surprise to me. I knew that they were going through kind of a rough spot, but didn't imagine them ever divorcing. And they said, well, so my mom's like, yeah, we're splitting up, so that means, of course, that we're all going to have to move out of this house, the only house that I've ever lived in my whole life. So I'm like, okay, let me think of all of my support systems. The family, well, that's not really there at the moment because they're splitting apart. The very home I live in, okay, I'm going to have to move out of that. My girlfriend, oh wait, that one just broke up. Okay, my good dear friends, I'm like, oh yeah, and that's the worst of it. So suddenly I was just left without any sort of support system at all. And then the hammer really hit when I was a young college student at the time, and I learned about determinism from the B.F. Skinner, the whole cause and effect, people have no freedom of choice, maybe in Buddhist lingo, dependent arising, that whole sort of thing that you can't really blame anybody. I'm expressing it this way because it's meaningful in this situation. You can't really blame anybody for anything they've done because they're just the victim of circumstance. It's how they were raised, in certain situations come up, like, okay, yeah, there were things that I didn't know about my parents and that's why they were divorcing. And the reason that my friends did all this stuff to me was because, yeah, that's the way the universe played the cards in their life, and I can't really blame them for what they did. And that philosophy, that line of thinking, just completely paralyzed me. I'm like, I can't be upset with anybody for anything that they've done, and I can't say that anything is particularly bad about this because it's all a matter of circumstances. And of course, I was raised Catholic. Well, not of course, but I was. And so, Catholics don't divorce, but my parents were. And the whole determinism thing went very much against cause and effect. It went against good and evil. So I was severely messed up. And then I started to think about, I'll get to this in just a second too. Let me see, I gotta come back up. So I started to think about that situation I had back when I first received that Dear John letter with the little gray being. And I thought, were they trying to warn me about this event? Because right now, I gotta tell you, I feel like I had every possible negative emotion just sucked right out of me, and I don't know what to do, and I'm in a really rough spot. And so I dwelled on that for a while, and eventually, not long after, is when I hooked up with MUFON and started the hypnotic regressions. And on the sixth and what would be the last hypnotic regression that I had with Shirley Coyne in 1994, this is the part that relates to stepping outside of time. Instead of the normal regression sessions that we would have, she lived in a trailer in Flushing, Michigan, and she had a room. It was a nice one, and there was a room set up specifically for her. That was her office and for regressions. So I sat in the chair that I normally sat in to look back at various things that had happened in my life that were ET related. And this particular time, though, was different. As I sat there, instead of that normal feeling I had of sinking into the chair, I felt as if I was levitating, that I was floating up into the air. And everything became very crisp white around me. I felt like the walls of the trailer fell apart in all directions, the ceiling flew up, and that I flew up an immense and unimaginable distance into this place that had no sense of space, time, anything. It was just this whiteness everywhere. And I could still vaguely hear Shirley's voice say, let's go back to something that may have bothered you in your life. And so I went to try to examine different various things that had happened from my childhood, some of which I covered already here. But every time I tried to focus on one, I got a feeling that I would call sort of like a whitewash. It would blur out, it would phase out, that somebody very intentionally was just saying, no, don't look at that. And after trying a number of different events in my life that I knew were ET related and failing because they kept getting consistently whitewashed, I'm like, okay, I give up. All right, what's going on here? And this voice said to me, you keep focusing on the bad things that have happened between us. And you shouldn't do that. You are very concerned about your safety and what will happen to you. And you shouldn't be concerned because from where we are at, we see your entire life as one. We are watching your entire life right now, and you're going to turn out fine. Nothing bad is going to happen to you, so don't worry. And I felt like I dropped very heavily back into the chair, and it felt like I gained like 1,000 pounds. It was just so heavy again in the chair. And I slowly started to move and get out of it, and I opened my eyes and looked, and there was Shirley Coyne. And she's like, oh, there you are. She goes, I kind of lost you for a while there. And so I said, yeah, I said this was really weird, and I told her what happened, and she just stared at me. I'm like, so have you heard that before? Do you know what that is? And she just kind of quietly shook her head no. I'm like, okay. And I got up, and the first thing I had to do once I was able to start flexing my muscles again was I had to get up and go to the bathroom. So I got up and I went down the hall into the bathroom. Her husband was in the next room laying on the couch. And as I was in the bathroom, her husband says to her, he's like, I don't know if we should tell him, but there were 3 of them in here. And she's like, what? 3 what? He goes, what do you think? There were 3 grays that showed up. He goes, shortly after you went in and started your regression session. He goes, and they just left a couple minutes ago. And she's like, what did you do? And I'm in the bathroom listening to this. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's a trailer. I can hear you. The walls aren't that thick. And so he's like, I just laid here. And they stood there. And he goes, it seemed like they were somehow guarding the place or interested in what you were doing. He's like, what did you do in there? And she's like, well, I started asking him questions. And then he just stopped responding. And then so I started doing other stuff in there. And then he came to again. And so I'm like, okay. So I come out of the bathroom, and I'm like, okay. So I go up to him, and I said, I looked, and they both had this weird look on their face. And I'm like, okay, so what's up? And she's like, nothing. And I'm like, is there something going on? I said, you look concerned. And she's like, oh, no, we were just talking. I'm like, okay. And they never did tell me. I completely overheard their conversation, but she never, and they're both deceased now, God bless them, but they never told me anything about what had happened while I was in there. And I stopped to think, I'm like, yes, this is another one of those situations where I was out of body, wherever I was, and they were keenly interested in what was happening to me. To me, I think that is the trigger, that I had somehow gone out of body and that instantly attracted them. This span of time that I'm covering here in my life, I'm probably telling you about 1/3 of the weird things that happen, but I'm staying on a particular set of circumstances because they follow a particular narrative I think is important to share. But yeah, there have been many times since in my life where I've been out of body, and that always attracts them. So at one point in this span of time, and I'm gonna jump to that particular night, actually. That night, so I left the Coyne's house. I drove home. Still, at this point in my life, I had always slept with the lights on, the fan, and the junk on the floor, and the stuff by the door, and you can make a whole song out of it probably. But I was, when I got home and I went to bed that night, however it worked, and I was able to sleep with the lights off, no TV or radio, the door wide open, the windows open, ever since that point through the rest of my life. Somehow, being in that white realm, receiving that message, actually worked on a level that I couldn't even describe why that was happening. Somehow they felt it was important for me to be able to be at peace and to sleep at peace. And 20 years on, it worked. However it worked, I don't know. Because at the time I didn't feel that it worked. I just felt scared and weirded out. So at another point in that span of time, they showed up in my bedroom late at night. This was before we had actually moved out of the house yet. And they had a young girl with them, and she was about 16, completely nude, but not in any sort of attractive way. She looked very emaciated and kind of sad and scared herself. And so I wake up and I see this hybrid girl, the first and only hybrid I've ever seen. I've seen her twice in my life, and this was the first time. And I see 3 grays behind her. I'm not feeling any fear, just confusion. And they're all just staring at me. And I'm like, okay, what's going on here? And they were just, I could tell that the 3 little grays were watching me, seeing what I would do next. And I go, what's her name? And they said, yes, what's her name? Like they wanted me to name her. So I thought, well, I'll give her a nice, friendly name, Angel. And they're like, yay! In their sort of telepathic, little happy fireworks, flashy way where they actually just stand there, but you can tell they're really delighted. And so I'm like, okay, Angel, okay. what's next? And she just stood there just completely embarrassed and didn't want to be there at all. And then they blinked out and I went back to sleep. And I don't know if it was for my benefit that they brought her as a friend or for their benefit to try to maybe she was raised on board and they wanted to get her out on the town and maybe meet people. I have no idea what that was about, but clearly she was very uncomfortable with the whole situation. She wasn't doing this of her own volition. They just brought her with them. Okay, so fast forwarding a little bit. So for years, I couldn't date. There was nothing in me that could connect with another individual. My friendship with Kyle got back on track eventually because he wasn't the worst of it. He only dated her after I dated her. My friend Don, that would eventually come around too, but several years after the events that I'm about to tell you. My friend Herb, he and I never became friends again. He was actually quite proud of the fact that he was dating her behind my back, and I guess he even wrote a song about it. And I got to hear it once, and he's like, "Oh, you got your head in a cloud, but I got your girl, and now it's me who's proud," or something. Just terrible. This terrible song. I'm like, you can't go back to friendship with a guy like who writes a song like that. Our mutual friend John, who had a cabin up in Lewiston, Michigan. On occasion, he would invite whomever of his friends, say, "Hey, I'm doing a cabin weekend this particular weekend. How'd you like to come up?" And whoever was available would come up. And as it had happened, that Vicky and I never selected the same weekend to go up. It just so happened that way. But John asked me, "Hey, he puts out his invitation," and I said, "Yes, I'll come up to the cabin." And Vicky says, "Yes, I'll come up to the cabin." And I'm like, oh, this is not good. But should I back out? I'm like, no, she'll blink. She'll back out. Neither of us backed out. And so we went, she was actually married by this time. And I had heard only unpleasant things about her husband, but I was only to find out that it was even worse than I had imagined. So we go up to John's cabin. There was an extended group of friends there. It wasn't just John and myself and Vicky and her new husband. But it was winter, and so they didn't have the water running. If you wanted to go to the bathroom, you had to use the outhouse. And the bathroom wasn't being used for anything, and there was a distinct lack of space in this small cabin, so I slept in the bathroom. I got some of the lawn furniture cushions, put it in the bathtub, and that was my bed. And it was quite cold in there because they also didn't heat the bathroom, so I had several layers on. But the weekend, so Vicky's husband was a complete jackass. He was just a real character. He would say, "Oh, what do you do for work?" and then put down whatever anybody said that they did for a living at that point. Very rude. And then when it came to ask him, "Oh, what do you do for a living?" he said, "Oh, I work with computers," and that's all he would tell people. Come to find out later, his computer was registered at a fast food restaurant. No shame in working at a fast food place, but don't tell people that you work with computers. And he insisted on being shirtless pretty much the whole weekend. And some people can get away with it. This guy, no way should he have had his shirt off even for a blink of an eye. It was not right. It was not right. And he would do other things, like we had soup, and after he was done eating all the food out of the soup bowl, he dumped the broth back into the soup pot. He asked, we needed to go on a beer run, and he said, "I'll do it." And so we gave him the money, and he goes, "Can I keep the change?" And our friend John says, "Sure, whatever, this is the type of beer we want." We specifically gave him, whatever beer brand we wanted. And he comes back with the cheapest beer that the place had. And so John says, we told you what kind of beer they wanted. Did they have it? He's like, yeah, but this was a cheaper beer, and that way I get to keep more of the money because you said I could keep the change. So this was the type of guy that my previous sweetheart was now married to. And it was a small cabin, and obviously winter, and you can't really get away from that. So as they were a couple, he insisted on taking the largest bed in the cabin, which normally was reserved for John. It's his cabin, obviously he gets the nice bed. But no, Vicky's husband insisted that they take it because they were a couple and they needed that slightly bigger bed. So John acquiesced, being a good host. Well, the thing is that this bedroom was on the other side of the wall of the bathroom where I'm sleeping. So late that night, I'm sleeping, and this is, to give you a time frame, this is the beginning of 95 actually at this point. It's January of 1995. And I'm sleeping in the bathtub, and I suddenly hear, I'm like, no, that's not what I think I hear. I'm like, no, and they're getting amorous with each other, and I'm like, I do not want to hear this. This is not right. And then they start talking to each other, kind of dirty, and I'm like, what the heck? I'm like, I'm in this bathtub up north with this woman that I despise and her husband that I now despise even more, and they're sweet talking on the other side of this. I'm like, this is so completely absurd. And then I just start laughing, crying with laughter. I'm in the tub. It's like this uproarious laughter. And I feel all this weight lifting off me. And I'm like, I don't want to wake everybody up. I got to get out of here. So I go running out of the cabin, and I'm just laughing my full head off. And I go running through the woods, and I come to this other road that is somewhere near the cabin that I've never been on before. And I'm just still going down the road, just laughing and being silly. And then I run out of breath a little bit, so I'm walking down the road, and I'm like, no way. And I see that very exact house I had seen back that one morning 4 years earlier. There was no doubt this was exactly the house. I had never seen it before anywhere outside of that dream, if you want to call it that. And I was like, holy cow. And I'm like, should I walk back? I'm like, well, I'm here now. And I continued to walk, nothing in front of the house. It was gone. And then I realized that from this particular point in time, one way I like to look at it is that they sent a message back to me 4 years earlier and said, when you find yourself in this particular place, at whatever particular time you get here, that is when this weight will be lifted. That is when you'll be able to live again. But we want to give you a warning that some bad stuff is on the way. And I realized, and then from that point, I didn't care about her, and I was normalized. I was just completely fine again after that. That dark spell that was over me for several years was now gone when I actually arrived at this place. And I mean, it was a very memorable event the first time it happened, and so when I got there, I knew exactly where I was. And I'm like, this was a 4-year period that all of this just happened. And they were watching this whole situation, and they seemed to actually care about what was happening to me. I'm like, that is a lot different than, oh, we just took you in the middle of the night, we did this operation on you and dumped you back. For some reason, this was important enough for them to participate in my life and basically give me the message that they were watching over me and they were concerned about me during this period of time. And there's one more event after that. In March of 95, just a couple months later, I met this wonderful girl, Tammy, and we connected very quickly, effortlessly, and it was May at the point of this particular event that I'm about to describe. And she and I were hitting it off really well. And there comes a point in a time of a relationship, if you're an experiencer, how do you break it to the person you're dating what's been happening to you? And it starts to weigh on you a little bit, like at some point I'm just gonna have to tell her, maybe break the ice and say, have you ever seen any UFO shows on TV, that sort of a thing. But this was going so well, and this was my first relationship after several years. So I'm like, I don't want to blow it. I kept putting out the feelers about how she felt about even the UFO phenomena in general. So come May 95, these pictures that you see are from the very exact day of the event. She and I, Tammy and I, went to a local park, and we went walking around, hiking around, and as the sun started to come down, I actually don't remember whose idea it was to stargaze rather than leave, but we went and we found a hill, and I scouted it out and said, yeah, this is a good hill to do some stargazing. And so she says, cool. And so as she started to climb the hill, I took this picture. So this is her actually climbing up the hill that we were on. And we set out the blanket that we had for picnic purposes that was in one of our backpacks. And we're laying there, and we watched the stars for as long as that was interesting to us, a few seconds, And then we started the smooching, and so we're like laying there doing the smooching thing. And then the sun went down, and it was dark, and so we're up on this hill. And then all of a sudden, it got very quiet. All of the sounds in the woods around us just completely stopped. I'm like, okay, that's kind of odd. And then I hear these footsteps come walking up the hill. Very distinct, very human-sounding footsteps. I'm like, oh no, not now, not here, not like this. I haven't even touched on the subject with her. So I got kind of nervous, and so I said, oh yeah, I just need to get up and, let's stand up, So we go and we walk up to a part of the hill, and as we're kind of looking up at the sky, she says, oh, look, it's the Big Dipper. And I said, oh, no, actually, that's the Little Dipper. I just learned that in an astronomy class I had. And it was the earliest college, and I'm telling you this, it was the earliest college class I've ever had. It was so early in the morning that I could barely stay awake, and I kept the best notes I've had in any class ever. And that's how I know what the stars are in the sky now. And she's like, oh, that's very interesting. And then we got into a conversation about how pricey college books were at that time. And then I'm like, okay, things seem sort of normal now. Maybe it was just an overactive imagination. So we laid back on the blanket and we start to smooching again. And then all of a sudden it gets very quiet. And then I hear footsteps coming up the hill, and I'm like, but my reaction wasn't, oh, not again. My reaction was, that seems familiar. I didn't remember that, but this is a very difficult thing to explain, how this scene played out. But to me, it was more of a feeling of deja vu. I did not distinctly remember that we had just done this. So I said, oh, maybe we should get up, stand up. And so she and I stand up, and she says, look, it's the Big Dipper. And I'm like, that seems familiar. And so I said, that's the Little Dipper, etc., college book discussion. Oh, it's quiet. Oh, let's go lay back down in the blanket. Smooch. Oh, it's quiet. Oh, footsteps coming up the hill. Get up. And so went up to the top of the hill again, and I'm like, this is really odd. Okay. This seems really familiar. And she goes, look, that's the Big Dipper. I'm like, no, that's the Little Dipper. And then we're talking about the price of books again. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, we just totally had this discussion twice already. This is, And then I'm like, we got to get out of here. But suddenly we were both paralyzed, staring at each other. And of course, who comes to the party? These three little gray guys walk right up to us and surround us, and they approach her. They don't approach me, they approach her. And again, I have not told her a single thing about my background like this. And they're staring up and down at her like they're inspecting her very closely, and they're looking at each other, and they're not even looking at me. And then I could overhear their telepathic banter, and they're like, no, not her. No, she's not the one. No, we don't like this one. And then they slowly walk down the hill, and they're on their way. And then we could move again, and boy, did we move. We grabbed our stuff, which is right there, and we ran to the very edge. They were gone, these little guys were long gone by this point. We hightailed it to the edge of the park. We ran, and didn't look back, hopped in the car, sped away, and as we were driving home, which is about a 45-minute drive from there, we were just completely quiet. We didn't talk to each other for the longest time. We just sort of stared ahead. And as we started to get closer to home, I'm like, do you want me to drop you off home now? And she's like, no. I'm like, what should we do? And she's like, I don't know. So we drove into the Meijer parking lot. I had an idea. It actually turned out to be a good idea. We drove into the Meijer parking lot. If you're familiar with Meijer, it's a big Walmart-style store. And they are open 24 hours, and it was quite late at that point. I have no idea about the exact passage of time during this. But we walked into Meijer, and we started picking up things like pens, balls of yarn, looking at it, toys. We went up and down all the aisles, picking up these consumerist comforts and signs of basically human civilization almost, to ground us, to comfort us. And then we sat. They had a pet aisle at the time, and we watched the hamsters on their wheel and whatever for I don't know how long, until we sort of came down, and then I dropped her off at home. Very quickly after that, she broke up. We never discussed what had happened after that. Not a single word about it. And although I don't know that she knew what had happened had anything to do with me, I think I know she knew that it had everything to do with me on the hill, and that pretty much busted up the relationship there. Thanks, guys. So, anyway. January 6th, 1996. This is just a little postscript to the story. I looked at my horoscope today. I very rarely did, but interestingly, I assumed January 6th was the anniversary of that Dear John letter back in 1991. Come to find out it was January 7th, but for the point of this story, me believing that it was January 6th actually, I guess, has some meaning. I looked at my horoscope, which I didn't normally do, and it says you'll be reunited with an old friend, avoid any risky business ventures, and a new romantic interest will appear. It said all of these things. So I'm like, okay. And very shortly after that, my friend Kyle, who I hadn't spoken to in several months, we were just doing our own thing, and it was unusual for us to be out of touch for that long. He calls and says, oh, hey, do you want to do laser tag tonight with these friends of mine from college? I said, sure, that's fine. So we went out and played laser tag and left and came back to a restaurant after to eat. And his college buddy says, are you familiar with long distance plans that you can actually start your own business and get other people on board? And I'm like, oh, this is that risky business venture, okay. And so I can check two things off of this. But I'm like, at this point, it's like 10:30 p.m. or whatever. I'm like, there's only an hour and a half for this romantic interest to appear. And so the waitress comes up, and she says, hi, I'm Becky, I'll be your server. I'm like, I know you. You're the sister of this other friend of ours. And she's like, yeah. And I know that, interestingly, our friend John had put out his annual "It's Wintertime, Come Up to My Cabin" invite. And I know her older brother often gets invited to the same cabin and that she has tagged along in the past. So I said, hey, are you going to John's cabin this year? And she goes, well, I wasn't really thinking about it. And I said, oh, you should, just like that, you should. And so she leaves, and she comes back, and she goes, yeah, I got the day off. I'm like, what? So anyway, so we go up to John's cabin. Here's her and I first picture together. It turned out that new romantic interest paid off. We eventually got married, and are still married, and now have 2 munchkins. Interestingly, the gentleman that married us is an experiencer by the name of David Kaywood, who has now left this earth too. He was certified to be able to conduct marriages, so I thought that was super cool to be married by a brother experiencer. And rewinding back to that visit to John's cabin in January of 1996, that is where my wife and I had our first kiss. Coincidence? I don't know. So I want to say that this span of time that I had in my early 20s, I've been dying to tell this story, so please forgive me telling these awkward stories from my younger days, but there isn't any way for me to have explained the relevance of that time loop that I was in, that I had on the Hill, nor the regression session that I had where I actually stepped out of time and the entities, whatever they are, consoled me, nor that strange thing that I like to call time travel, because I don't know how better to explain how I found myself in this place twice and under such unusual circumstances. I do think that they can often show long-term interest. I think they intended my wife and I to be together for whatever reason. Several psychics have told my wife and I ever since we started dating that we were going to have 2 kids, and we were just like, oh, we're not ever going to have kids. And eventually, of course, we had 2 kids. So for some reason, and I can't explain why on earth they would think that's important, as Keith said, they're not going to come all this way to screw up people's governmental systems. I mean, why on earth would they come all this way to make sure some schlep from the Detroit area, lands on his feet after a rough breakup? I have no idea, but it was some sort of a long-term interest they had. And I think all through my life, for whatever reason, they've been participatory. And I can't think of any really reasonable reason for that. And I have seen it in many other people's lives too. These types of stories, it takes a long time to unpack a story like this. So I appreciate your patience of me being able to do it. And really, I've been waiting to tell this story for so long. The library talks I do, where I give the usual UFO 101 talks, I can't begin to describe anything like this. So I needed to sort of have a home field advantage when I finally got this story out. And so it's been really special for me to be able to share such a weird span of my time. But right now, of course, that first bunch of stuff I talked about is in my book. Please buy my book. It's good. Yay, it's only $10. And if you buy it on Amazon, it's like $12.95 or something, whatever they want to charge for it. So obviously cheaper here. And for the next phase of my life, I was going to put out a second book, which covered basically the material I spoke about today, but having a wife and 2 kids makes it difficult to tell a story like this. Because oh, Dad put out a book, cool, what's it about? Oh, ex-girlfriends, all right? So basically, so basically what I'm doing is releasing the information episodically in my newsletter, my personal newsletter. It's called Experiencer Chronicle. What I've done is every quarter I put out a new one, and it includes the next chapter in this sort of story to sort of meet it out and not have like this something as auspicious of a book as a book out there. And I also include in it, several people have come and told me stories saying, here's an interesting story, I just thought people should know about it. So I include other people's accounts. If you have an account of something interesting that happened to you, take a look at my newsletter. It's free online at experiencer.us. And if you like what you see, feel free to contribute something yourself. I release everything and with anonymity, so in any case, I hope you like it, because I will continue to tell the unusual things that happened to me in it. Thanks so very much.